Hi everyone, I hope you're all really well and I hope you're really looking forward to Samhain or to Bealtaine or Beltane if that's what you're celebrating in the Southern Hemisphere. I have been thinking about making this video for a little while, and I think it was partly the season of Samhain that made me start thinking about the question of death and remembrance and our connection to people who have passed away and things like that, because this is kind of the time of year when we do think about that. But also there were a couple of other reasons why maybe I've been thinking about this question a little bit more in the last several years. So as you will know if you've watched my previous video, I lost my cat 3 years ago, and I was really close to her. She was my childhood pet who I'd had since I was 10 years old, and I loved her so much. I absolutely loved her as a part of our core family, and losing her was a first for me. It was a new experience. I had lost family members before. I'd lost my grandparents and a kind of distant aunt and some neighbours and things like that, all older people, apart from my aunt who was a little younger, but I didn't know her very well. So I had experienced death before, and that was definitely tricky before. It's not that I'd never experienced losing somebody that I cared about, but losing my cat was different in a way because I felt quite responsible for her, and because I suppose she had been getting old, but it was quite a shock and all these different factors. So it was definitely the first time that I really had to deal with the loss of a creature or a person who I was really that closely bonded to. So I suppose that just got me thinking about how I deal with the question of death and how I experience it and how I think about my own mortality. And then inevitably, because it's coming up to my 30th birthday, which also falls on Samhain, I think big birthdays also make us think about our own mortality, because we're faced with the reality that we are getting older, that our time on this earth as this human being is limited, and at some point it's going to run out, and we have to kind of come to terms with that and make peace with that. So there's kind of a dual-pronged issue really, coming to terms with losing other people and coming to terms with our own mortality. So I'm not going to delve too much into the question of dealing with other people's demise, because I feel like it's something that I haven't had enough experience of myself to really give any advice on. I think losing a cat, even when it's a very close pet, is very different to losing a very close human. And like I say, I still haven't figured that out. I still haven't figured out that process. Having parents who are getting older, they're by no means elderly, and they're still thankfully in their health. But that is definitely something that I'm noticing more, that they are getting older. So it is something that's in my mind and something that I'm aware that I'm going to have to deal with in the future, but it's not something that I've necessarily learned how to deal with, and it's not something that I've really thought about a lot in terms of my spirituality and how I see that. I think the way I've been grappling with it more is more to do with coming to terms with how I and myself am going to eventually die, eventually pass away, eventually be returned to the earth. So that is kind of, that phrase I used there at the end, that's kind of been the key for me in terms of being okay with the idea and thinking about it in a really, not in an abstract way, but in a really concrete way, is thinking about the fact that my body will return to the earth. So on the outset, that looks like maybe quite a bleak understanding of death. So if, like me, you have a spiritual belief in which you don't actually believe in a separate soul that's separate to the physical body, if you don't necessarily believe in a conscious kind of afterlife, you might have also struggled with this idea of the kind of bleakness of the fact that your whole being is going to return to the earth, that there is going to be nothing of you physically and mentally left after death, and that you are just going to dissipate back into the earth and that's going to be it, that you're gone and that's over. And I have found that the only way for me really to come to terms with that and really to feel positive about that part of life, that inevitability, is to frame that as a positive thing. To frame it as this part of this amazing creative cosmic process whereby everything that is in being has kind of come out of this one amazing existence, of this cosmos that we don't fully understand, and everything that's in it has kind of been formed into its particular shape over time through different processes, and inevitably over time all of those different kind of forms that have arisen in cosmos, they do return back to the all. And so it's kind of a positive way of thinking about the process, of thinking, well, this is just part of this cosmic cycle. And I think being really in tune with that cycle and really revering it in ritual, really revering it as part of your spiritual practice, can really help with that too. So you're really tapping into the fact that the destructive nature of cosmos is not a negative thing, it's just part of the whole creative cycle, and also that the destruction of particular forms is totally necessary to create new ones. So that is how creativity happens. It happens through the destruction of old forms. So the fact that you are going to return to the earth means that cosmos can continue to create new things, to create maybe new humans. So kind of indirectly, there is this sense that you might be passing away and returning to the earth, but you may be creating another human. So even if you haven't had biological children, you may be creating another human through the carbon that you are releasing back into the earth, through all of the molecules that are in your body that are going to return to the earth, that are going to dissipate by a very kind of a loose kind of connection. That earth may turn to plants, may turn to food for animals, which will be food for humans, and so on. This kind of cycle, this chain of connectivity. And or even actually water is an easier way of thinking about that as well, because the cycle of water is relatively quick, and so any water molecules in your body, I'm sorry, I realize that for any scientists out there, you're going to be cringing really hard at what I'm saying right now, because my understanding of this is limited, but water gets evaporated and returns to the earth as rain. So you have I would say a relatively fast cycle of water. So the water that's contained within your body is absolutely going to be drunk and consumed by other humans in the not too distant future, and that's happening all the time. So yeah, I think getting on board with that idea that the fact that the entirety of you, if that's your belief, is going to be subsumed into the earth and basically destroyed, getting on board with that, like not necessarily being a negative thing, I think is the start. And I realize that that's like a tricky kind of switch to make. If you're seeing it as a negative thing, if it's something that you just desperately don't want to happen, even if it's not a desperate feeling, even if it's more just a kind of a feeling of despair or a feeling of pointlessness or meaninglessness, the fact that you are just this fleeting creature who's just going to disappear again, and what's the point in doing anything because it's just going to all be over soon. I realise that it's quite like tricky maybe to kind of make that shift from thinking of it as a kind of a negative thing to a positive thing, but I really think that working on it over time and working it into your spiritual practice through seeing that process as being a positive creative process and something that you are in awe of and that you want to revere, that will help over time. So another thing that I would like to mention as well is the idea of legacy. So I've already mentioned the fact that even your physical body, that it will be leaving some sort of legacy. You're not just going to disappear. When your body rots and kind of returns to the earth, it's not you dissipating. Like all of those cells are still going to exist in maybe a different form. They are transformed. They don't just poof it back into the air, like they are transformed into different substance. So they are transformed into part of the earth, basically. So, I mean, that's if you're being buried, if you're being cremated, it's kind of a similar thing. Again, you're being transformed to ashes, and those ashes are being returned ultimately to the earth, even if you're in an urn for a long time or whatever. Ultimately, that's kind of what's happening. And I could go on about that actually, and I won't bother going into the detail of that because yeah. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, there is a legacy in that your physical form is not just disappearing, it's not just dissipating, it is returning, it's being subsumed, it's becoming part of the whole. And you can think of that and think of your selfhood of it as sort of not disappearing, but just being dispersed and broadening out and being sent out basically into the world. But also I think it's important to think about your legacy, because this is something that people I think get a little bit hung up on. I think a lot of people who are artistic, who have a drive to create stuff and put things out into the world, I think a lot of the time that is driven from a place of a desire to leave a mark, a desire to not disappear completely. And sometimes that is coming from a place of fear. And that can lead us to have kind of crazy reactions to things like turning 30 or turning a new big age, turning 40, turning 50, turning 60. It can have a kind of reaction in us where we feel like we haven't done enough. We haven't created enough of a legacy to satisfy ourselves, because we have an idea in our minds of what that's supposed to look like. We think that that should look like a best-selling novel, or even just a published novel, or whatever kind of amounts of different things that we see, or say a biological child. And if you're not able to have a biological child, that could be causing you a similar kind of, I mean, I'm aware that in that instance that's a tricky subject, and there are lots of different reasons why that is very, very difficult to come to terms with, but that might be part of it, this sense that you leaving a legacy must look a certain way. So I would definitely urge you to think about legacy leaving in a different way, to kind of reframe it and remind yourself that these ideas that you have, these kind of rigid ideas you have of what a legacy needs to look like, that is just socially imposed. Those are things that you've just picked up during your lifetime, that other people have suggested to you, whether directly or indirectly, and you are absolutely free to change that in your own mind and to change that story for yourself. Again, this is going to take time. This is something that you're going to have to work on over time. But I would say just to give a little bit more credence to the legacy that you leave all the time through every single interaction you have with another human being or with anything you do in your life. So it doesn't have to be a big finished product. It doesn't have to be, thousands or millions of people consuming your work. It can be as simple as having an effect on another human being. It can be as simple as having an experience, and then therefore that experience changes you, and that changes how you interact with your surroundings and other people. It can be as simple as just doing something to affect political change, environmental change, anything like that. Every single thing that you do at every moment is having an effect on the world around you. And obviously that can be a negative effect, but I think it's really important to think about the positive ways that you're creating this legacy, and the fact that even if after you pass on, even if the memory of you eventually disappears, if you don't have children, if you don't have a later generation, and if there isn't necessarily this memory being carried on in people's conscious minds, the effect that you had on the world still lingers, because there's kind of going to be a knock-on effect. Everything has a knock-on effect, right? So there will be knock-on effects from everything that you have done in this life. And I think that's a really important way of thinking about it too, is that it kind of reminds us again of the importance of the individual. I think it's very easy to get caught up in this idea that the individual doesn't matter, especially if we have a kind of a concept of the self where it is something that doesn't necessarily persist after death. Then it's very easy to feel very insignificant, and as though our existence is kind of meaningless in the bigger picture, and to lose ourselves in this idea of the universe as being so vast that what on earth could we possibly do to change it. But I think reframing that, and sometimes if you have a certain belief ingrained, it can be difficult to change it, but I would just advise maybe just putting yourself in the path of material that suggests otherwise. Like looking into things like the butterfly effect, and just really thinking about the fact that you don't have to see things necessarily in that one way. And everything is kind of contextual. You can definitely make an argument for the relative insignificance of individual humans on the planet versus the entire universe, but it's hard to kind of quantify that. It's hard to kind of put a number on that and say, well, what counts as making an effect? What counts as making a difference? Because it's also completely illogical to say that each individual human doesn't have an effect, because of course we do. Of course we cannot be alive in this world without making change in this world. That's just how it all works. It's literally just how this universe works. If something exists in it, it's doing things in it, it's causing change. So that might help as well. And like I say, just working with that idea of legacy more generally, and getting honest with yourself about what really does matter to you, about what you really do want to be putting out there into the world, and what actually maybe isn't that important, what you have maybe just inherited from other people and that you're imposing on yourself, but at the end of the day, maybe it really doesn't matter if you don't get that done. And you can actually just set that to one side and say, it's fine, I'll just focus on this other thing, I'll just focus on these different aspects of my life, and be content with that, and be satisfied with that, and be happy with what it is that I'm contributing to the world. So up till now, I've really been talking from a perspective that could be aligned with an atheistic one, or a pantheistic one, or quite a lot of different worldviews, just really any worldview where, like I say, you don't necessarily believe in a soul or a conscious kind of form of the self that continues after death. But now I just really want to briefly make mention of a kind of shift in perception that I had at one point that definitely changed my understanding of personal death, and even of the idea of the self kind of disappearing and this sense of self that we have, that it is going to end. And this is a lot more kind of mystical, it's a lot more quote unquote spiritual, for want of a better word. I know that's kind of a vague term, but it was just this kind of experience that I had one time that I've probably talked about before, where I really, and it wasn't like a new idea to me, it was more that I just experienced it in a kind of mystical way. I had been meditating a lot, and the actual experience kind of happened in nature as I was out for a walk, but I had been meditating a lot and just thinking a lot about my connection to everything else. So when I meditate, that is often what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to bring about this sense of losing myself, like my sense of strict selfhood, and just kind of expanding myself outward into the world. And just losing that sense of like me as my ego just moving through space and time here and now. And I think all of that kind of combined to bring about this experience, which was just a very visceral and hard to describe, hard to put in words, experience of a complete realization and understanding of the fact that everything is connected and that I am one with everything, and that even the conscious thoughts that I'm having, even everything that feels like it's coming from inside my brain, is actually just a channeling of this whole experience of existence through this one particular physical brain. And it really led to this belief that I still hold, and that was maybe particularly strong at that time in my life, but that has really kind of stayed with me. And it's something that can't necessarily be verified or argued against, but it's this feeling that I got, that my conscious mind, my experience of awareness, that it ran outside of just my personal self. It was a feeling that the sense of awareness that we have that underlies all of our kind of conscious thoughts, all of our kind of monkey mind kind of chatter, the sense of awareness that we have that underlies that this is something universal. It's something that just is in existence. And therefore it's kind of, we're thinking about it consciously because we have brains that can do that. We have brains that can kind of understand that in a particular kind of way, and that can think abstractly and logically and with language and all of this really complicated stuff. But at the end of the day, it is just channeling this sense of awareness that is kind of universal in this existence. And the kind of weird realization or new belief that I kind of found was this feeling that this sense of awareness was the same in absolutely every human being, because it was something universal that I was just channeling through my physical brain. It was something that was present in every single human. And so it kind of boiled down into this idea of like, well, maybe we don't have individual souls. Like, I don't believe in that personally. Maybe our kind of individual experiences are going to come to an end and we're going to dissipate back into the earth and go back into that cycle. But this sense of me-ness, of I, of the experiences that I'm having, that doesn't disappear because that is universal. That is happening right now in every other single human being in the same way on this planet. And also this sense of awareness is just in every single thing, in every atom of this universe. And through the experiences that I'm having through this physical form, I am changing that. I am leaving my mark in some way on that sense of awareness, because I've changed the world. So if the world changes, then that kind of, I don't really want to call it kind of a cosmic consciousness or a universal consciousness, because I feel like that's calling it something that I'm not really seeing it as. I think that's kind of maybe doing a little bit too much anthropomorphization on it, and maybe kind of reifying it a little bit too much. But that's kind of roughly how I started to see things. Now, I'm not saying that you need to have this experience or have this belief in order to come to terms with physical death, but it's just an example of a kind of mystical experience that I had that I was able to internalize and go with and feel comfortable with and bring in alignment with the rest of my beliefs without necessarily changing my kind of pantheistic and monistic beliefs, where, you know, there isn't a separate soul, there isn't a separate part of myself that is going to continue after my death. So I hope that was helpful in some way. Like I say, it's going to be different for you. You're going to have different experiences and different beliefs, and maybe you do believe in a soul that is going to transcend your physical existence. But maybe you found something helpful in here anyway, even if you do believe in that. That might be something, I think, coming to terms with our physical death is something that we all kind of need to get to grips with at various times in our lives too. And also, of course, coming to terms with the loss of other people. In terms of never, in theory, I think when I had this experience, the last one that I talked about, where I felt like the kind of interconnectedness of everything and of all consciousness, of all awareness, you would think that that would have translated into me feeling as though the people I loved were never actually gone, that they were still very much present and with me. And I don't know if I've yet translated that into that sense. To some degree, I can still very much feel my cat with me. She still lives in my memories, and I can still feel that closeness to her. But I know that when she first passed on, that I just felt, what I really felt was a loss. I really felt a lack of her presence. And that was very difficult to come to terms with too. So it's still very much a work in progress for me. It's still something that I'm going to have to, throughout my lifetime, just repeatedly deal with and come to terms with and work through. But I hope that something I said here was helpful for you. If you have any thoughts that you want to share, do leave a comment down below. Don't forget to like this video, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to make sure that you see every video that I post. So I hope you all have a wonderful Samhain, or like I said, a Bealtaine or Beltane if that's what you're celebrating. I hope you're all really doing really well. Sorry that I haven't been making so many videos recently. I've really been focusing on writing my novel and getting my 10k run, both of which I am kind of completed to my satisfaction for the moment. And yeah, I'm hoping to be focusing a little bit more on Anya Orga in the coming months. So hopefully you'll be seeing a little bit more of me here on the channel and just in general. So yeah, thanks for watching, thanks for stopping by, and I'll talk to you again soon.